My name is Nicole Clark. I am 30 years old, and a few hours ago, my father told me to go live on the streets. His exact words were, "If you are so determined to chase this stupid dream, then pack your things and go live in the streets like the losers you admire." He did not know that I already make $35 million a year. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I did not cry. I did not ask why. I just stood at the end of that heavy oak table and looked at him while my phone buzzed with a notification for a new wire transfer. Anger was not loud this time, it was clinical. For years, I have been the silent investor in his version of family. Now, I realized it had been a subscription and I was finally footing the bill for the last time. This was not a breakdown, it was an accounting. The air in that dining room always smelled of old leather and the stale dust of the Texas Hill Country, a physical weight that had pressed down on my shoulders for 30 years. It was the scent of my father's world, a world where worth was measured in calluses and the number of head of cattle in the north pasture. Across from me, Gregory stood like a monument to a dying era. His face was a map of sun-damaged pride and absolute conviction. He looked at me with a disgust so pure it should have been chilling, but all I felt was a strange, analytical distance. He did not see a daughter who had spent her nights mastering the architecture of green tech logistics. He saw a drifter, a failure who sat in front of a glowing screen while the real work was being done at the cattle gates. "Look at your sister," he growled. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated the silver on the table. "Sarah's out there in the dirt every morning, a real veterinarian keeping this legacy alive while you chase fairy dust on the internet." Sarah sat to his right, her expression a practiced mask of reliable concern that did not quite reach her eyes. She was the golden child because she followed the script, playing the role of the devoted ranch hand daughter for a legacy that was bleeding money behind the scenes. I glanced at my mother, Julia, who stared at her porcelain plate, as if the patterns could shield her from the fallout. She was the silent witness to my exile. Her submissiveness was just another brick in the wall Gregory had built around our lives. In my mind, a different dashboard was glowing, the one Gregory could not comprehend. I was not thinking about his disappointment or the property I was being ordered to leave. I was thinking about the $35 million in annual recurring revenue that had just been confirmed in my private account. I was the shadow giant he had tried to step on, never realizing that the ground he stood on was already mine. There was a time when his dismissal would have felt like a death sentence. I had spent decades shrinking myself, trying to fit into the narrow aisles of his expectations. But tonight, that need for validation had simply evaporated. My compassion for his struggle had been a luxury he had overdrafted for years, and the account was now closed. I picked up the overnight bag I had already packed. The handle was cold and familiar in my grip. "You are right, Dad," I said. My voice was so level, it seemed to startle him. "I do not belong at this table. I haven't for a long time." I did not wait for a response. I did not need the last word, because the numbers in my bank account were the only punctuation that mattered now. As I walked toward the door, I realized that for some people, the only way they will ever see your light is if you leave them in the dark. The porch light clicked off behind me before I had even reached the sidewalk. It was Gregory's final punctuation mark. "No, wait, no, come back." Just a sudden, sharp darkness. I drove until the ranch house was a flickering ghost in my rearview mirror. Then I pulled over onto the shoulder of the dirt road. The silence of the Texas night was absolute, broken only by the ticking of my cooling engine. I did not reach for a tissue. I reached for my laptop. The screen hummed to life, casting a cold blue glow over the steering wheel. This was not a breakdown. It was the start of a systematic, professional separation. For years, Gregory had been running his cattle tracking and automated gate systems on a high-tier satellite data plan he believed was a government subsidy. He did not know it was a recurring expense I had been footing secretly for 3 years. To me, the $60 per month was nothing compared to my $35 million annual revenue. But to the ranch, it was the central nervous system of the entire operation. My finger hovered over the deactivate service button. I did not hesitate. Click. One cord cut. I leaned my head back and stared into the dark. People would look at my years of silence, my quiet endurance of his insults, and call it weakness. They would ask why a woman making millions would stay in a house where she was treated like a drifter. But they do not understand the survivor's invisible chain. Growing up in a household where your worth is tied to your obedience is like living in a prison without bars. You do not stay because you lack the strength to leave. You stay because you have been trained to believe that your strength is a betrayal. My silence was not a choice. It was a survival strategy. I was building my own empire in the shadows, brick by brick, while he mocked me for playing on the computer. Every insult was just another reason to work harder, until the digital drawbridge was finished. Tonight, I did not just leave a house. I walked out of a psychological cell. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. A message from Naomi, my business partner. Nicole, the ink is almost dry on the Austin deal. 2 weeks. Let them think you are nothing until then. I stared at the message until the light dimmed. Naomi was right. My revenge was not going to be a shouting match in a dusty dining room. It was going to be an accounting so undeniable that it would shatter the very foundation Gregory's pride was built on. I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road. The drifter was gone. The CEO was heading home. As I drove toward the neon glow of Austin, the vast darkness of the hill country felt less like a void and more like a clean slate. I looked at the digital clock on my dashboard. It had been exactly 47 minutes since Gregory told me to find a bed on the pavement. Most people would expect me to feel a crushing sense of loss, but all I could think about was the $250,000 I had spent to keep that very pavement under his feet 2 years ago. The ranch had not been thriving for a long time. Gregory's legacy was a house of cards, held together by grit and my silent intervention. 2 years ago, I sat in my studio apartment and watched a foreclosure notice for the ranch land appear on a public records database I had flagged. The back taxes and interest had ballooned to $250,000. Gregory was desperate, though his pride would not let him say the word. He spent those weeks snapping at me, calling my remote consulting make-believe work, while he walked the perimeter of a property he was days away from losing. I did not ask him for permission to save him. I did not want the gratitude, because I knew he was not capable of giving it to someone he did not respect. Instead, I used a shell company to wire $250,000 directly to the county tax office. I let him believe a clerical error had been found, or that a distant relative's old trust had finally cleared. I watched the relief wash over him, and then I watched him immediately turn that relief back into the normalized cruelty that defined our home. This is the trap of people like Gregory. In his world, if you cannot see the sweat on a person's brow or the dirt under their fingernails, their success is not just invisible, it is an insult to his identity. He relied on a hierarchy where he was the provider and I was the worthless burden. By making me the family failure, he could justify his own struggle. My secret wealth was a threat to the only story that allowed him to feel powerful. He needed me to be small so he could feel like a giant. I realized then that his cruelty was not personal. It was a defense mechanism for a man who had anchored his entire self-worth to a dying way of life. He had spent 18 years providing me with the bare minimum of food and shelter, and he believed that act gave him a lifetime subscription to my obedience. He viewed our relationship as a debt I could never fully amortize. I pulled out my phone and checked my personal banking app. The balance was a clinical reminder of my reality. I had been the anonymous benefactor of his pride for long enough. I had paid for his mistakes, his taxes, and his ego, all while he laughed about my online fantasy with the rest of the family at Sunday dinner. My compassion had been a luxury he had overdrafted, until the account hit zero. The Austin skyline was close now. Tomorrow, I would meet with my legal team to finalize the Horizon Dynamics contract. The ranch was no longer my responsibility. It was a line item I was ready to write off. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. The following week in Austin was a storm of digital noise and physical silence. Gregory's texts arrived like erratic bursts of static, each one more unhinged than the last. He was not apologizing for ordering me to sleep on concrete. He was raging about the technical glitches at the ranch. The cattle tracking was offline. The automated gates were stuck. And the inventory system was a black hole. He called it a curse, a string of bad luck, or a sign that the universe was punishing him for having a daughter like me. He had no idea I was the one who had reached into the ranch's digital nervous system and pulled the plug. I watched his messages scroll by with a chilling, clinical detachment. I did not feel the old urge to explain or apologize. I simply swiped them into a folder labeled evidence. Sarah chimed in too. Her messages were a masterclass in the gaslighting that had defined our relationship since childhood. "Nicole, you are being incredibly petty," she wrote. "Dad was just trying to push you to be your best. You know he has a temper. Now the ranch is in a crisis, and you are hiding in the city like a child. Come back and help us fix this." I stared at the words until they blurred. Her version of my exile was a minor disagreement, a temper that should be forgiven, for the sake of a legacy that did not even recognize my existence. She did not want a sister. She wanted a free IT consultant. My compassion had been a resource they had strip-mined for years, and they were shocked that the vein had finally run dry. Then came the public shaming. Gregory posted on the local Hill Country community page a rambling paragraph about how true family understands the value of blood and dirt, while some people are blinded by the greed of glowing screens. He did not name me, but he did not have to. In our town, everyone knew who the computer drifter was. He was trying to burn my reputation to ash before I could even build a fire. I ignored it all. I spent my days in a glass-walled conference room, 40 stories above the Austin skyline, preparing for the most significant announcement in the history of green tech logistics. The Horizon Dynamics contract was no longer a possibility. It was a $35 million reality, waiting for a signature. My team was moving with a lethal precision, finalizing the details of a partnership that would change the industry. I stood at the window and looked out over the city. The horizon stretched out like a promise. I thought about the $250,000 I had spent to save his land, and the $60 a month I had spent to keep his gates moving. I had been the ghost in his machine, the silent architect of his survival. He had thrown me out because he could not control a world he did not understand, and now that world was about to move on without him. The Austin Tech Summit was not just a professional milestone, it was my public awakening. I was not just a daughter who had been exiled. I was a sovereign power entering the field. My revenge was not going to be a loud argument or a bitter phone call. It was going to be the silent, undeniable weight of a success that would make his entire world look small. The technical glitches Gregory was raging about were just the symptoms of a much deeper rot he had invited into his own legacy. While I was 40 floors up, finalizing the $35 million partnership that would change the green tech industry, my legal team was performing an autopsy on the Clark Ranch's financial records. I was not looking for an apology anymore, I was looking for the final balance. This was not a breakdown. It was a cold, systematic audit of every lie he had told, to keep himself feeling powerful. My lead attorney, Marcus, walked into my office just as the sun was beginning to set over Austin. He did not have a greeting, he had a folder. "Nicole, we found it," he said, setting the documents on my desk with a heavy thud. "Your father tried to sell the 10 acres of childhood property, the land he told you was worthless drifter soil, to a local development group to cover the ranch's rising debts." I looked at the signature on the bottom of the deed transfer. It was a perfect imitation of my handwriting, a flourish I had used since I was 18. "He forged it," I said. My voice was as flat as a digital readout. Anger was not loud. It was analytical. Gregory did not just throw me out of the house. He had tried to erase my legal existence to save his own pride. He viewed my name as just another tool in his shed, something he could use and discard when it suited the family legacy. But Gregory had been playing a game from 20 years ago, and I was playing the one that mattered now. What he does not know, I told Marcus, is that I did not just spend the last 3 years building software. I spent the last 6 months buying out the junior water rights surrounding those 10 acres and the primary aquifer access for the entire North Pasture. In Texas, dirt is just dirt, but water is life. By forging my signature to sell that land, Gregory had unwittingly handed me the lethal discovery I needed to end his control forever. The sale he thought would save him was now a criminal paper trail leading straight back to his front door. More importantly, the land he sold was now functionally useless because I owned the only water access that made it habitable for cattle. I had been the silent investor in his version of family footing the bill while he overdrafted my compassion, but now the debt was due in full. I looked at the forged signature one last time before closing the folder. Gregory had committed a felony to stay relevant in a world that had already passed him by. He thought he was cutting me off, but he had actually cut the only safety net he had left. He was a criminal now, and his legacy was a crime scene. I did not feel sadness, and I did not feel a need for revenge. I felt the quiet, lethal satisfaction of an account that had finally been settled. The shadow giant was stepping into the light, and I was holding every receipt for every time he had underestimated me. The lobby of my headquarters in Austin is made of polished marble and silence, a space that Gregory and Julia looked like they were polluting just by standing in it. Gregory still wore his work jacket. The smell of cattle and diesel clung to him like a desperate prayer. He walked toward me with the heavy, rhythmic tread of a man who still believed his shadow was long enough to cover me. Julia trailed behind him, her eyes darting toward the security guards, as if she expected to be arrested for his arrogance. They did not come to apologize. They came to lecture the drifter who had dared to cut the ranch's digital cord. "You have had your little tantrum, Nicole," Gregory began. His voice was booming in a room designed for whispers. "But people are talking. The neighbors, the church, they think we have failed you. You are coming home, you are fixing the systems you broke, and you are going to act like a Clark." He spoke as if I were still that girl standing in the dust, begging for a glance that was not a critique. He did not realize that his authority had always been a performance, a script he wrote that I had finally stopped reading. I did not answer. I led them into a small, glass-walled side lounge. I synced my laptop to the massive screen on the wall. "I do not think you understand the math of this situation, Dad," I said. My voice was clinical and quiet. I tapped the remote. The dashboard filled the room. The number $35,024,000 in annual recurring revenue glowed in bright, unwavering white. Gregory stared at the screen, his jaw working, but no words coming out. In that moment, I watched his posture shrink. It was the power illusion of an empty wallet. For 30 years, Gregory's authority was not built on character or wisdom. It was built on the perceived leverage of providing for me. He used his status as a provider to demand my silence and my soul. But the second he saw that I did not just have money, but an empire that made his ranch look like a hobby, the wallet he had used to hit me with was suddenly empty. His power was not internal. It was a shell that cracked the moment he realized I was the one who could buy and sell his entire existence. "This is not just about the money you saw on the news," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "Remember the 10 acres you tried to sell last week? The ones you forged my signature for?" He went from red to a sickly gray. "I bought the water rights for the surrounding pastures 6 months ago. The land you sold is a desert now, and the cattle Sarah is trying to save, they are thirsty. Because the automated wells are on the data plan, I just canceled." He did not yell. He did not pound his fist. He looked at the floor of the glass lounge and whispered, "The cattle will die, Nicole. We need that water." He was no longer the predator. He was a man begging for the water rights to save his dying cattle. The power flip was complete. "I am not the daughter you told to live on the streets," I told him. The words were as final as a legal verdict. "I am the owner of the house you are standing in and the water you are begging for." I stood up and walked toward the door. I did not feel revenge. I felt an accurate balance sheet. I did not press charges for the forgery. Sending a 50-year-old man to prison would not give me back the 30 years I lost. Instead, I had Marcus drop a different kind of contract. My father signed over the remaining ranch titles in exchange for my silence and the return of the water. He and Julia still live in the big house, and Sarah still works the pastures, but they do it as guests in an empire they no longer control. I am the owner of the land and the water now, and my terms are final. I used a portion of my $35 million annual revenue to establish the Clark Conservation Trust. It provides scholarships and seed funding for young engineers and tech founders from rural areas who are told their work is not real. I want to ensure they never have to choose between their roots and their potential. This is a letter to those who have always felt like they were living on the edge of their own family. For the ones who have been told their dreams are just make-believe, or that they are a useless failure. Your value does not shrink just because someone you love refuses to see it. True self-worth is the life you build when you finally stop asking for permission to exist. I stood in my penthouse that morning, watching the sun rise over the hill country. Everything stayed silent for once, and for the first time in years, the silence did not feel like a weight. It felt like peace. If this story hit home for you, hit the share button. Do not let anyone dim your light just because they do not understand it. Subscribe for more.